So as Joel noted, I'll be speaking today about some of the ways communities communicate information about hazard risks to potentially at-risk residents, and a new approach that my team is exploring through a partnership with several communities on Vancouver Island to help their residents learn about, prepare for, and respond to local environmental threats. And just before I begin, I'd like to recognize that I'm going to be using the term hazard throughout today's presentation to include both climate hazards and environmental hazards very broadly. So I'm not focusing it in just on natural hazards, for example. All right, before I begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. I'm coming to you today from the city of Calgary, the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda people. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and we'd like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many different places and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. We couldn't be doing any of the work that I'll be talking about here today without the support of our two partners. UBC's Community University Engagement Support Fund has allowed us to have the in-person and eventual virtual workshops that we conducted with our community partners. And MIAPAR's Knowledge Mobilization Fund has definitely allowed us to create the work in the background and the development of the CHERP mobile app that Joel mentioned at the beginning. So just to kind of give us some context, particularly for those that might be from outside of Canada, I wanted to look at where the study area that most of the work I'll be talking about is being done right now. So for those that are maybe not familiar with Canada, British Columbia is on the west coast in Pacific Ocean, and we'll be looking today mostly at Vancouver Island, which is located west of the mainland, and you can just see UBC's Point Grey campus is shown there in blue. Just west of that is Vancouver Island. Now, much of my research has focused on tsunami risk on Vancouver Island, particularly in the area around Port Alberni, known as the Alberni Valley. In addition to tsunamis, communities in this area are exposed to many different hazards, including coastal and overland flooding, wildfires, and many different kinds of weather events, to name just a few. Most recently, I've been exploring how residents of these communities perceive and prepare for future hazard events as one aspect of community resilience building. Certainly one of many, but definitely an important one in that. So as part of this work, I've looked at least dozens, if not hundreds, of community websites from the very, very small up to the Vancouvers in size, and looked at the different approaches that these communities are using to communicate information about hazards to their residents. I'm not going to give you the full rundown on that, but I do want to just look at some of the typical approaches that are being used commonly in our area. So usually the website is the heart of their risk communication efforts. It's usually where communities refer people to. That's where most up-to-date information is usually available. And it really is the core of their messaging in many cases. Usually there will be a hazards page, or sometimes that's broken into separate pages, and they reference the specific hazards that that community is most likely to be encountering. More often than not, there's also a preparedness checklist. So this is either one checklist or maybe a series of checklists, depending on the hazards, that kind of gives some ideas of what people can do. If we bump that up a level, we can see that often there are hazard risk maps or evacuation maps that are included for specific hazards or particular areas. And more recently, we've definitely seen this push towards mobile alerting that can be signed up for directly on community websites. And that's kind of the template that we see broadly across different areas. Some of the issues with this is that it is on a web page. Often these are not optimized for smaller devices like mobile devices. There also is a reliance that these devices will be available in the event of an internet outage or a power outage. Often there are issues with the ways that people interpret maps. So as a geographer and a cartographer, I'm always amazed at how you can show someone a map and sometimes they just don't get it. And that is definitely true, particularly with hazards as well. One of the other big issues that we see as I look at all of these websites is this idea of wayfinding. So how does someone that's interested in learning about hazards in a community actually get to that information? So it's not uncommon for hazard information critical to residents to understand and prepare for disasters to be buried several levels deep within a community's website structure. And here I'm going to pick on the city of Oceanside in California. To get to that information, I need to click on government, know that I have to go to fire, then to divisions, which doesn't necessarily make sense to me, and then finally get down to disaster preparedness before that takes me to a page which links to other pages for each of their hazards. So at a minimum, we're looking at 5 different clicks to get to what I'm looking for. In contrast, if we look at the city of Seaside in Oregon, you can see that there's an emergency preparedness link right on the homepage. And this does a couple of things. It's reinforcing that there is emergency preparedness is an important part of being a resident of the community, but it also makes it very quick and easy to find if needed. I'll also look to Seattle, where their public safety is part of the main menu. It's right there. It's the second item on the list, and all of the potential information you need is available right from that click. And more locally around here, the city of Richmond, which has it, I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of in the second bar there. Public safety is right next to careers, right on the homepage, and directly links to appropriate information. So those are kind of counters to that website founding. And there's certainly many, many others I could show. Regardless of how you get there, though, the state of emergency messaging is pretty similar from community to community. Usually this tends to be general and generic by necessity. This makes sense when we're trying to reach and educate a very large audience about specific risks. It tends to include things like the general description of the hazard mechanisms. So for example, for earthquakes, something along the lines of how plates interact, or maybe how faults work. Things to look for before a disaster, or in the case of tsunamis, that might be water retreating rapidly away from the shore. And then actions that households can take in advance to help reduce potential impacts to their homes. Things like moving electronics off of lower levels if you live in a flood zone. And finally, those short preparedness checklists that I spoke about earlier, these usually have between about 10 and 15 items. They almost always include first aid kits, radios, flashlights, food and water, and then the other items kind of switch in and out as needed. Now, there are next level steps that we definitely see some communities taking. Whoops, jumped ahead there. And that includes guides that include detailed hazard risk information, identifying areas that are most likely to be impacted by specific hazards. So we see here the city of Oceanside, Oregon's tsunami evacuation map is a great example. They've identified 2 risk zones in this case. So the green represents safe areas, yellow represents kind of areas you need to be worried about if there's a local earthquake, and then orange represents areas that need to be evacuated in the event of any tsunami warning. They almost always include major roadways, and if they're looking at pedestrian evacuation, also pathways. They usually highlight key landmarks. For example, in the case of tsunamis, that might be evacuation towers so that you can get to safety if you're in a really bad zone. Or they might just be used for reference, things like the police station. And then finally, we see things like evacuation routes and safe destination locations pointed out here. I don't know if you can see it on this map, but those A's really represent those safe destinations. In some cases where rapid evacuation is required, we actually see this go another level where they look at how to evacuate in terms of time to encourage people that live in the most vulnerable areas to evacuate more quickly, potentially than those living in less vulnerable areas. And we see that for Long Beach and Seaview in the US there. And that's a joint mapping project that's happening with both federal and state governments in Washington. And our final kind of last look, and this is becoming a little bit more of a blip on my radar than it's been in the past, is the idea of interactive web tools, where you can either zoom in on a map to specific areas to learn about local risks, or you enter your address into that piece to specifically make that information available. So I'm going to transition a little bit from what we're doing right now as communities to communicate this information and look at household preparedness and look at whether we're prepared, and if not, why we don't tend to prepare for disasters. So for the first of these, household emergency preparedness is a leading contributor to overall community hazard resilience. If you don't have a prepared population, your community is not going to be particularly resilient in the face of a threat. We know that from studies of past disasters globally, that prepared households have generally been better able to respond, have faster recovery times and better recovery outcomes compared to similar households that did not prepare. Prepared households can begin putting their plans in place immediately, and this often helps to put them at the front of the line for things like insurance recoveries or for assistance claims. When I had my research assistant look at a review of the literature, so both practitioner literature and the academic literature, what she found was a couple of key pieces. 17 to 51% of households that experienced a disaster were prepared prior to that disaster. So that's pretty low. Patton and Johnson found that in their study of Australian households, about 27% indicated that regardless of what they were told, they just simply would not develop a household emergency plan. So that kind of sets the upper threshold at somewhere around 30%. Finally, we identified that persons with disabilities were more likely to report being unprepared for a disaster than their other peers in the community. And that's something we've really taken to heart and something that we're trying to work with in the CHERP app I'll be talking about right away. Now, if you think, okay, this is around the world, it's probably better in Canada where we have things like skidoos and we know how to get around. Unfortunately, the studies that we have seen, not that there are that many of them in Canada, have actually shown that actual preparedness levels range somewhere between 20 and 50%, depending on the study, the region being studied, how recently those areas have experienced a disaster, and how risk communication is being communicated to residents by officials. Now, this is definitely a problem for all kinds of communities, but it's especially important for smaller, more remote communities that already face challenges not shared by their larger, more urban peers, and often have lower response and recovery capacities. In January of 2018, there was a tsunami warning issued for communities across Vancouver Island following a massive, a very large anyways, 7.9 earthquake in the Gulf of Alaska that resulted in the 3 a.m. evacuation of residents in the Alberni Valley where I do my research. My colleague Alexa Tanner and I use this as an opportunity to better understand public perceptions of tsunami risk, household preparedness, and evacuation responses in Port Alberni through a pair of doorstep and online surveys funded by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. And I won't go into that in any real detail, but I do want to bring out a couple of key points. First, about 10% of the survey respondents indicated they were uncertain if their home was located within the official inundation zone. And this despite reasonably good maps available both online and in paper form to residents. For those that did indicate that they felt they knew they were in or out of that zone, it turned out about 8% were actually incorrect in whether their home was located within or outside of that inundation zone. So that just speaks to that ability to interpret maps and how we communicate this information to our residents. Further complicating issues, about 17% indicated they were unclear where to evacuate to, and we had a bunch of different places that people kind of dispersed to. There were 16% that were unclear where to find official instructions, and while there were some complications that led to that, it's certainly an issue. And overall, we found about 40% of residents indicated that their household had an emergency plan in place prior to evacuation. So it's on the higher end for Canada, but still not as good as we might like. And unfortunately, when we asked about their performance of those plans, roughly half said that their plans were not particularly effective for them. So what are some of the barriers to home preparedness? Well, there's several, and I'm just going to mention the 4 most cited. Number 1, easily, is lack of time. And I think everyone on the call can definitely understand that. We're all busy people. Second was a lack of resources, either a perceived lack of money, space, or vehicles that would be necessary to fully prepare. And third, a lack of knowledge. So they just didn't know where to get started, and often that was enough to prevent them from beginning in the first place. Another item that does come up is this assignment of responsibility. So there's an assessment for some individuals that the responsibility lies entirely with their community, the province, or the federal government, so that they basically have no responsibility. They just react what they're told to do down the road. And I think that's something that we need to look at and change. Now, it's not just these issues that unfortunately face us. It's not my area of expertise. I'd definitely refer you back to my colleague Alexa Tanner on this, but I want to highlight just 6 quick behavioral biases that also complicate our desire to basically enact preparedness actions. The first of these is optimistic bias, where some people just judge themselves to be less likely to be harmed than other people. The second is the normalcy bias, where people tend to underestimate both the likelihood and severity of potential future risks and assume the best. Third is status quo bias. Some people tend to assume the future will be much like the past, therefore downplaying any need to prepare for any unlikely future events. We have this idea that very small odds in some people's minds means that will never happen. And so they don't choose to prepare because they just don't think it can happen. Excuse me. And prospect theory, which basically says that our immediate costs are felt much more strongly than potential future costs. So if it's going to cost me $1 today, even if it's going to cost me 10 in the future, I'm not going to necessarily take that action. And finally, anchoring on past events. So for people who have experienced a disaster in their past, they believe that future events will play out pretty much the same as they've already experienced, even though that's not necessarily the case. So given that we have these set of barriers and biases, what can we do to encourage community residents to undertake preparedness actions? Well, there's 4 or 5 key points that I really want to stress here. Clearly communicating risk to residents that are most likely to experience those and providing easy access to more information. So in the case of tsunami zones, if you have a clearly identified zones, make sure you're reinforcing messaging in those particular areas through things like mail pamphlets, etc. Reinforcing messages across multiple platforms. So have it on your website, definitely have it reoccur in social media messaging, but also some novel ideas like did you know sections on tax assessments or utility bills if your community is control of those. Hosting community events, and here I'd like to call out the city of Tofino, district of Tofino, sorry, who hosts a fair that basically helps to educate residents about disasters in the area and to help them to prepare for that, including things like a high ground hike. And then workshops. So these don't have to be large affairs. They do require some resources, but you can team up with civic groups in your community, church groups, school groups, it doesn't matter. Anything to help get that message out and reinforce that. Thirdly, just building confidence using very small actions. Preparedness is often seen as this huge elephant that needs to be taken, when in fact, what we can do is just take little bites of that process along the way, using things that don't require any materials or require very few materials that we may already have at home. That gets people started, and then they can move up to those larger actions down the road. And then kind of looking at making household preparedness a family affair, both in the messaging that communities use, but also in joint efforts. So encouraging local schools to make emergency planning part of back to school at the beginning of the year, or in some cases at the end of the year. Now, if you're with the community looking at what you can do to make the biggest change, here's what I would suggest. Review and revise all of your materials that are kind of getting stale. What we know from speaking with residents is that they're looking for quick and easy answers to a small number of questions. What they don't necessarily want are these long technical articles about how the mechanisms of a particular disaster work. Now, some certainly are looking for that, so you do want to include it, but it doesn't need to be the thing that they see first. What they want to know is basically who's likely to be affected, and more importantly, am I likely to be infected? Then they want to know what actions they can take to prepare, what they need to do during an emergency, where they should go if they need to leave their homes, how they should get there and what they should bring. And finally, what they can look for current information in an emergency. So where are your social media links, website links, what is going to be updated during an emergency? If you want to take things to the next level, work towards making it personal. So we already showed that interactive website earlier, but basically make ways for residents to enter their address and find out unambiguously if they live in a danger zone. And if they live in more than one, if your community has those. Depending on the hazards you're exposed to, you may also want to include things like primary and backup official evacuation routes and or sites, and locations of emergency shelters or service centers if that's relevant to your community. Now, I know not all of these are always going to be prepared for all hazards, so you do have to consider what that looks like in your community. But what I think is that by making it personal, we kind of remove some of those barriers, the issues that people were experiencing, and make it much easier for them to take action on their own. And that leads me to this concept of CHERP. So as Joel said, CHERP stands for the Canadian Hazards Emergency Response and Preparedness Initiative. So we're looking at both emergency response and preparedness in the households. And essentially our whole goal is to answer a single question. And that's what would happen if we help to make it quicker and easier for community residents to prepare for and respond to local hazard threats. Now, unfortunately, there's really quite a lot packed up inside of that question. And I'm not going to get into that in great detail today. I could definitely answer questions about that down the road if people have questions, but it is kind of the foundation on which we're building all of the rest of the tools. For the first phase of the project, which started in 2019, our team partnered with 7 communities on Vancouver Island, some of which are actually with us today, and it's great to see you. Our goal was to learn about some of the barriers and planning issues that these communities faced, depending on their size and location. So just for reference, if we kind of go from the north end of the island south, we have the village of Tassos, which has about 200 people in the winter and grows a little bit larger in the summer. We have the district of Tofino, which has just shy of 2,000 people in the summer, and that expands significantly over, 2,000 in the winter, expands significantly over the summer. We have the area around Port Alberni, the Alberni Valley, and the Alberni Cloudcoat Regional District, the Qualicum Beach and Parksville communities together, and the city of Nanaimo with just over 100,000 people. And then Oak Bay in the Capital District on the south end of the island also contributed their ideas to the workshops that we held, but will not be one of our initial rollout communities. So together with these 7 communities, we identified a basic template of information that residents need to better understand, prepare for, and respond to future hazard-related events. We explored how best to share this information with the residents and what actions residents could take to become more hazard resilient. And this work led directly to the development of the CHERP mobile app for iPhone and iPad devices. Now, if you're on an Android device, don't worry, we're coming to you. It's okay. The app helps to educate residents about local hazard risks based on information derived directly from local planning documents, hazard risk and vulnerability assessments, any recent studies that have been conducted in the region, either through academic studies or third-party contractors, and national risk data sets. And I just want to call out Geological Survey of Canada's recent work on earthquakes, particularly along the West Coast. Now, CHERP uses information provided both by residents and our partner communities to determine which preparedness and response actions best fit their household's unique needs. And this results in a set of dynamic emergency plans that adapt as the family ages and changes. You can think of it as kind of like a dating site to match a family with the actions that they need to be taking. CHERP starts with a community profile for each of our partner communities with content specific to that community. So when you sign up, you only receive information that's relevant to your community and nothing else. Each profile begins with a list of the hazards that are relevant to that particular community, along with relative risk ratings derived from official planning documents. By tapping on one of those, you open up that particular hazards profile to learn more about it without it getting in the way. Where these are implemented, information about warning and notification systems is presented along with links to register for alerts. So here we see the screen for the District of Tofino again, and we see that they have tsunami warnings in place. So you can click on that to go to their website to look at tsunami warning information. They use the Buoyant Alert third-party alerting system, which allows residents to sign up to receive mobile alerts. And because they're in BC, they're also part of the Alert Ready system, which the province will activate for certain particular disasters. And we provide links to learn more about that system as well. Finally, we include links to official community websites, social media accounts, and any other information critical to residents in an emergency. No more need to hunt that information down during the emergency. That includes things like radio and TV station call letters and frequencies. Now, I mentioned that you can tap and open those hazard profiles. Right now, we have 11 hazards that are common to communities on Vancouver Island, and we're definitely going to be expanding that out. In absolutely no order, these are coastal flooding, heat events, wildfire, roadway closures, power outages, earthquakes, winter storm events, overland flooding, tsunamis, landslides, and hazardous material releases. And by clicking on each one of those, we include community risk information ratings derived from those documents. So we kind of give a risk assessment for that entire community. We have expert summaries that are 75 to 150 words, so very short, from leading experts throughout Canada, both as practitioners and within academics and in government. We also have how that risk stacks up across Canada and local risk summaries for each of our partner communities. And where data exists, information about household level risk ratings is included, along with that warning and notification system information I just referenced, and key community information channels. Finally, at the very bottom, we include our sources and links to additional information so that anyone who is interested in learning more about those specific hazards can do so simply by following the sources we used, or they can check us to make sure we've gotten it right. Where detailed risk assessments and geospatial hazard information exists, we incorporate that into our GIS models to establish household level risk ratings for each residential property and sometimes commercial properties in a given community based on their proximity to identified hazard zones. So for the District of Tofino here, CHERP allows users to quickly check if their home is located within a tsunami inundation or coastal flood zone based on recent studies that have been prepared for the district. Users will receive different preparedness and response guidance based on whether their home is located within one of these zones, adjacent to one of the zones, or well outside of the zones. So what we're seeing here is just the tsunami risk. There's a second map for coastal flooding, but you can see whether a particular property is in, near, or outside of those zones. Next up, to ensure residents receive relevant preparedness and response planning information from authoritative sources, our team has developed a data set of hundreds of possible actions, along with items for emergency kits and grab-and-go bags. These actions have been sourced from groups across Canada, the US, and abroad, including Public Safety Canada, Emergency Management BC's Prepared BC, and the Canadian Red Cross, to name but 3. Action descriptions have been simplified because in many cases, these are paragraphs of text, and we want to get it down to a very short, actionable item. We also word these to follow risk communication best practices. Each action description is basically what people need to do, and then there's additional instructions that occur down below that. These actions and items are specifically coded to appear only when it's relevant to a particular household's profile. And general actions that apply to any household are supplemented with community-specific information, including where it's relevant, local evacuation plans, safe destination locations, and local emergency information sources. Now, in order to do that matching, we need to determine which of those actions are appropriate for a given household. To do that, we collect information about users' homes, vehicles, family members, and pets. Now, some of this can be very sensitive information, so what we do is put things like age into broad categories. We also look at physical and mental disabilities, medical and mental health conditions such as anxiety, diabetes, and epilepsy. We look at the need for assistive aids, so a white cane for blind users, for example, or wheelchairs and walkers for people that need assistance in their movements, or even just contact lenses and prescription lenses. We have special instructions for households where some members are non-fluent in the local emergency languages, for the LGBTQ+ community, recent immigrants and refugees, and specific instructions for pets, depending on how easy they will be to evacuate based on instructions given to us by the users. Finally, we look at things like carless households and the needs of individual houses. So do they have a basement or crawl space that might be relevant to flooding, or they are required to use an elevator maybe to get down to safety? All of this comes together on a user's device. So we bring together that community hazard exposure and evacuation data that's per community and only for their community. We bring emergency response planning data set of hundreds of actions. And then only on their device, we have their household characteristics and profile. And all of that comes together to produce customized preparedness and response plans stored on their devices. Those apply specifically to the hazards they're most likely to encounter and are adapted to their unique needs. So CHERP provides users with a set of emergency preparedness checklists that they can complete in advance of an emergency and track their progress. So for example, this is really the only place in the app we've chosen to do a little bit of gamification, and it doesn't even show up in the screenshots here, but there's a little dial showing how complete you are. And if an action doesn't necessarily apply to your house, instead of making it so people can't complete that 100%, we allow you to ignore certain actions that might be relevant there. They also receive customized emergency kit lists for each household member, pet, and vehicle based on information provided by the users. And again, a little bit of gamification in place there. And in the event that the need ever does arise, they can activate one of these plans at any time by tapping on the red exclamation button at the bottom of the screen. What that will do is essentially allow them to choose from those hazards that are relevant in their community. And depending on the hazard, they may have additional choices in the time they have to respond. So usually instructions will say you have 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever that is. Or for something like a tsunami, you could have as much as 16 hours response time. We adapt those plans to those particular timeframes. Obviously not relevant for things like earthquakes that are happening and you don't have any prep for the most part. Now, I do want to just touch on user privacy because we are collecting some very sensitive information from our users. So we want to make sure that that is kind of paramount in our thoughts. And so the system has been built around protecting that privacy. All information is stored only on the user's devices and in their encrypted iCloud storage. We don't have a server anywhere that's collecting this information in any form in that way. What we do receive is a monthly ping from the device that contains very broad categorical data in an anonymous and aggregated form at the community level. This is enough to help us to understand our users' needs and to help our partner communities with their planning, while making it impossible to tie those responses back to individuals or households. We also include information next to each of the items that we ask information about to show kind of how it's being used, why we're collecting it, and who we might be sharing that with and in what format it's being shared. So for example, we might share age information in broad categories with our community partners just so they have a sense of what that looks like. But we're not going to share information about, for example, LGBTQ status. Now, earlier I mentioned in the tsunami talk that I was looking at in Port Alberni, this idea of the fog of uncertainty. Some groups were definitely unclear. There were 10% of households that said they were uncertain if they were in the zone, an additional 8% that were incorrect in that information. And we wanted to address this. And we do this very simply right at the very front. Whenever you click on your household tab on the screen, it'll show which zones you're exposed to and how you're exposed. So CHERP seeks to address this clearly, labeling household hazard exposure for each hazard where we can know that information in advance. So we don't necessarily have this for something like earthquakes where we don't get that information at the household level, but for things like coastal flooding, riverine flooding, tsunamis, landslides, those sorts of hazards, we can do this. We use clear color-coded iconography to reinforce the message that a home is outside, near, or within those identified zones, removing that ambiguity. And I just want to touch on color again. Accessibility is a big deal in this tool as well. And color is a commonly used method to quickly communicate information about risk to the public, as you can see in these examples. We know that specific colors can instantly convey information to us. Green is usually seen as good, red bad, blues and purples mean cool, while reds and oranges mean warm. Reds and oranges can also denote danger, while blues and greens denote safety. However, about 8% of men and 0.5% of women have color vision deficiency. So for some, it can be very difficult to discern colors or shades from others, while a small percentage see no color at all. I just kind of direct you to the second one on the right-hand screen, where once we've removed that color, it's virtually impossible to tell those categories apart. Now, CHERP does use a similar color scheme. We go blue to green to yellow to orange to red to represent increasing risk. However, we also include options to allow users to adjust that scheme to fit better if they're colorblind, require higher contrast, or both. We also supplement these cues with text labels and physical size changes, kind of like the ramp you can see on the right there, to ensure that there are always multiple methods of conveying information about risk to our users. And because we know that sometimes looking at black text on a white screen is not great, we've also incorporated the idea of a dark mode. And that's usable by anyone, not just people with specific disabilities. And they can choose to make it always black or always white, or go with whatever their device is currently showing. So that's the design of that app. And I just want to talk really briefly before we come to an end about where we're going in the next few months and years. So we are going to be launching the app in 6 of our partner communities in a staged rollout in early 2022. It would already be out the door, except I'm teaching right now and keep having to give webinar presentations. So that has slowed that process down a little bit. However, we will be starting with the village of Tassos and the district of Tofino just to make sure things are working, get that through, and then moving east from there to our additional communities. That's kind of the end of phase 1 for us. And we think it's great that we've had 7 community partners throughout this process, but we're actually looking for more. So in phase 2 of the project, starting late this year, we're going to focus on 5 key components. The development of an Android version, because we want the other 45 to 55% of the population to be able to use this. We want to expand to new communities and provinces. Vancouver Island has been a great incubation place for us, but we want to move out throughout BC, Alberta, and everywhere east. We also want to include Indigenous communities and hear from Indigenous voices. So the app is actually designed to incorporate Indigenous languages and French also, even though right now it's only in English. We're looking at new hazard profiles for additional hazards relevant to any new communities, including things like hurricanes, tornadoes, and avalanches, and maybe community-specific things like ice jams. And finally, we're going to continue to update our data set of hundreds of household preparedness and response actions, emergency kit items, etc. So we will be looking for partners for that late this year. If you represent one of those communities that might be interested, our website, ryanreynolds.ca/chirp, has an interested community form where you can provide that information to us and just tell us a little bit about your community's hazards exposure, and we can use that to connect with you a little later on down the road. I probably won't be able to right now because of my teaching commitments, but in a couple of weeks, you would hear back from me. So at this point, I'm going to hand back over to Joel to kind of look at some of the questions that may have been coming up. And I know certainly looking at any other comments that you might have about the site as well. We're always looking for ways to make improvements. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ryan. That's a beautiful piece of information synthesis and risk communication there. That's very impressive. If anybody does have any questions, I'll encourage you to jump over to the chat. You should be able to type your questions in. From there, we'll hand them over to Ryan and see what kinds of answers we can drum up for you. Maybe I'll just quickly start though. This is a lot of hazards, and that's a lot of risk mapping. How hard has it been to get that information, the raw information from some of your communities?
So that's actually a great question, because we are working directly with our community partners. And in most cases, they've already done this work. They've done the studies, they have that data either available, or with a little bit of processing, it can become available to us. So we're not doing as much as you might think. What we're doing is bringing that data in, throwing it into our GIS model, and it's just looking at a number of parameters. So proximity is the easiest one and relevant to all of our hazards. But for things like coastal flooding, for example, we look at water depth to see how in depth that household might be, and kind of give a risk assessment based on that. So if it's only going to be a centimeter of water, we're not going to be as concerned as if it's 13 feet, for example, and looking at that area. But yeah, that's a big piece. It's definitely the largest contribution that our community partners have to make in order to join the platform, is that data that gives us what we need to be able to do the household level risk assessments.
Yeah, so I think in a related question here, Allison's asking, how are these data sets taken up by the app? And a related question, over the long term, how is that information going to be managed, updated, renewed, refreshed?
Yeah, two very great and totally topical issues, because we're just dealing with those actually right now. So the data is initially sent to us in usually just in GIS format through emails, which we then incorporate into our model. So we are assuming right now, because it's 6 communities, that it's a one-time deal, which is fine. But obviously, as we progress, we want to make that more of an approach that we can update. So information that requires GIS processing, we still need that to be emailed in and be processed by our team. We're looking at turnaround times of probably about a month on that work. But for other information, things like website updates or adding of social media accounts, all of that, we're looking at ways to automate and bring in a little bit more easily than we are right now. And so we're going to be building a separate tool for our community partners that allows them to manage all of that as part of phase 2. And that way they're responsible for keeping that piece up to date, and they can do it as soon as they're aware of it. Or if we catch it and they didn't tell us about it, we can also put that in just in case.
Excellent. So I think this next question relates back to some of the research about people suggesting they are prepared or aren't prepared, or would prepare or wouldn't prepare. I guess the key question is, how do we define terms like prepared? Is it purely self-identified?
Yeah, so it really depends on the studies that are being conducted, but it seems like there's a very low bar being used to define what is prepared. So for some of these, just having bottled water on hand was deemed to be prepared. And I think that's probably too low for what we're looking at. Whereas in others, it was they had to have an emergency plan, they had to have an emergency kit of some kind to be deemed to be prepared, which might be those lower numbers that we see, that 17%. But I think somewhere in between those extremes is where we'd like it to be. But we're using that term extremely generously right now in order to start encouraging the process, and we can get a little bit tougher on that down the road, I think.
Excellent. So one thing I'd maybe ask as well, getting back to the idea that we're synthesizing all of this risk information, spatial data, do you get any pushback from people who are maybe a little wary about putting all that stuff out and available for anybody to use? I think about both, concerns about ringing alarm bells too early. But I also know that in some places that I've worked, there's pushback from homeowners who are concerned that their areas are being actively labeled as, you know, risky or unsellable, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely had pushback, almost always from the political level, not from the practitioner level, maybe. But the big pushback is housing value that we've seen. So I've actually done looks into this. I haven't done an official paper or anything on it yet, but from what I can tell, it actually looks like there might be a short-term dip once you've labeled these areas as being at risk and you've made that public, but it almost always comes back. And in many cases, it actually, the housing price rises because people are now no longer uncertain about that risk. They have certainty one way or the other. And so it's certainly an area I'd love to look at a little bit more detail down the road. But I think by being open, what we're doing is help instilling trust in the process. And we can work together as a larger, broad community to kind of explain to those that are a little bit concerned about this, that it doesn't necessarily have to be as bad as they might think it would be.
Perfect. So another question here, tsunami hazard mapping only identified the most risky event. How are people able to understand their overall hazard, risk tolerance, and priority actions if we only educate on the most extreme?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Is that's Aaron? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in a lot of the studies that we're working on right now, particularly on the west coast of Vancouver Island, looking at tsunami risk, what we do is usually it's a set of scenarios. So we look at one or more scenarios and kind of use that as our baseline for what we deem to be at risk. And sometimes this can be great. If you pick the correct worst case scenario, that kind of gives us that idea. So Cascadia subduction zone might be that for Vancouver area. But what we want to do is kind of look at what's also the most likely event. And so depending on the studies that our research partners or community partners have completed, we can actually bring that in as well. So we can give 2 risk ratings if we want. We don't currently have it in the app, but it is designed to do this, where we can say, you know, for a local hazard event, this is what your risk is going to be versus for a distant tsunami event. And tsunamis are one of the few where you can have a great variation in risk depending on location, compared to something else like an earthquake that's generally the same across an entire community. But it is an area that we're looking at and how we bring that information in, because we're not doing those assessments ourselves. We do have to rely on the work given to us by our community partners and their levels of risk tolerance that are built into those particular studies.
Excellent. Maybe I'll ask it, and this discussion of different risk levels and sort of setting your own tolerance sort of raises other questions I have about how some of the communities might be thinking about, say, risks today versus risks tomorrow, right? Are you seeing many communities asking about incorporating climate change projections into some of this modeling and into the app itself?
Yeah, I think there's a much more growth in this area than there was when we started out on the project ideas early in, or kind of late in 2018, early 2019. And that we're now looking at, okay, what does coastal flooding look like in the context of sea level rise or increased rains, or what is it, you know? And so we need to find ways of, as a community, looking at that language, kind of coming together on it, ensuring that the language is similar in nearby regions so that we don't have dramatic changes in that. And that's certainly something we're seeing in the capital region, where municipalities are coming together to define what those risks looks like, use shared data, et cetera, which I would encourage for any region that has a lot of communities in a small area. But it's also things like, okay, we did our risk assessment in 2018. You know, we've just done a climate assessment, which kind of makes that look maybe like we didn't do enough work. So how do we incorporate that piece in? And some of that can be done through communicating. So we alter the language a little bit to suggest these are baseline levels, not necessarily worst case levels. And in other cases, it's kind of impetus to push towards redoing those surveys or redoing the HRVAs, the hazard risk vulnerability assessments, to incorporate climate in a way that wouldn't have been done 5, 10, 15 years ago. Unfortunately, some communities, particularly smaller communities, don't have the resources that we would necessarily like them to have to be able to do this. And so encouraging kind of provincial involvement in that, defining what those thresholds might be, is also another way as a community to do that. Excuse me.
Excellent. So just a reminder, if there are any other questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. I think I might have exhausted my own questions.
That's fair. I do have one that I can kind of mention, just if anyone's thinking in the background. A question we commonly get is what happens to users' devices if they don't have power or they don't have internet connection or something like that. Unlike a web browser, which usually requires the machine to have either battery or power or some internet connectivity, unless your mobile device has no power, in which case you'd be in a little bit of trouble, what we do is actually all of that information gets stored on your device. So even if you're cut off from the rest of the world, you still have your emergency plans. They can be enacted, checked off. The only thing you're really losing is those links to outside websites and the sharing between your devices. So if you have an iPad and an iPhone, that connection gets broken when we lose that internet piece. But we can rely not only on Wi-Fi, but also on cellular in ways that laptop computers maybe can't, depending on your particular laptop. And so it is a little bit more flexible in that way. Now, if you don't have any battery in your app, it's kind of less useful. And we don't provide right now like a PDF copy of what that plan looks like, but it's something we're considering for version 2 as well.
Excellent. So another question from Taryn here. The LGBTQ plus tag in there, what kinds of information, or how helpful is that information? What does it guide in the preparedness preparation?
So there's kind of 2 areas in which we do that. One is looking at just making LGBTQ members a little bit more aware that often they're going to be in shelters, and there are sometimes conditions that might not be super friendly to them in those conditions. Now, it's less of an issue maybe in Canada than it might be elsewhere in the rest of the world, certainly, but it doesn't mean that that issue doesn't exist. And so we want to raise that awareness, give them strategies they can use to cope with that are coming out of this broader literature that we're seeing kind of across the world right now through LGBT research and science. But also we want to encourage that language to be incorporated into our communities as well, so that they're aware of this community, that they're integrating that information in, that they're making appropriate accommodations for things like language around transgender individuals, et cetera. So we do want to have it on kind of both sides of that piece, and it's definitely why it's in there. We could probably be doing a little bit more in that area, but it is kind of an area that we haven't spent a lot of time looking at. The same kind of goes for Indigenous rights and access and information that we'd like to get incorporated into that a little bit better, but we don't have that expertise. So we'd be looking for that for our community partners in the future as well.
Excellent. And so another question here, what are some of the plans for launching in these communities? So how will you spread the word, I guess? Is it outreach events? Any particular strategies of note?
So it's going to depend on each community. What we're doing in the initial rollout, we're not doing a big deal about it. We're just trying to make sure the app is actually out and working first. But we do have some money set aside to promote a photo contest, so that we do have a profile picture for each community. That's one way to kind of get people in. So we have rewards for those photo contests for each of our original partner members, and looking at what that brings. But we would also do a concerted kind of coordinated research effort, or sorry, communication effort at that stage, where we use our own resources at UBC to kind of push that and to kind of share information about it, link to local media, and also, social media as well to kind of get that information out. The big concern for us is we have to be clear that this is only in a small number of communities because of the labor intensive work in behind it. So we don't want to think just everyone can sign up and get it no matter where they live. So we do have to be a little bit careful about that.
As an avowed map nerd, it wouldn't take much to get me playing around with this thing.
Yeah, there's nothing stopping anyone from saying they live in Tofino and maybe dreaming a little.
Oh, excellent. I think this last question here, I think we've already answered. You're working on a way to make a hard copy available should somebody want one, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the large piece. We only had a limited amount of time and energy and resources to be able to pull this off for this particular phase. So this was one of those things that got dropped fairly early on. I'd really love to pick back up, is this way of having some offline resource. Now, the issue is, of course, these tend to get lost or not updated as frequently as we'd like versus the app, but it is a fallback. So as long as we acknowledge it in that way, I think it's fine. And we just have to kind of work at what that looks like, which it sounds like maybe isn't as difficult as I thought it would be, but I haven't actually tried implementing it yet. So.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. It's been really fascinating to see how the initial work that you're doing with tsunamis in Port Alberni has really grown into this larger multi hazard communication tool that, frankly, like I said, it looks like it's going to be fun to just sit around and play with. So I'll be a temporary resident of a couple of Vancouver Island communities, I suspect, sometime later on in this year, just playing with it and seeing how it works.
It is kind of fun to play with, I have to admit.
Oh, perfect. So we've got links up here for CHERP if you are interested in seeing more. And of course, just a reminder to check out our regular newsletter. You can find us at corpcop.com. Maybe Cindy, you could just post the link in there while we're saying our goodbyes in case people do want to find it. But we will be having some more webinars in the near future. I suspect we'll have our next one in April, when I think I might be talking about fishing and weather risk and communication to fish harvesters. So a very different sort of audience, but of course this kind of thing will keep going. And I'll just remind everybody as well that if you are a member, we're always happy to hear any bits of news you have, any exciting developments in your particular arenas that we could potentially share with the wider membership. So with that, thanks everybody. And as Cindy's pointing out, we will email out a link to the presentation. So if you do want to dig into this later on, or you maybe missed some notes, it'll be right there for you to dig into and find again. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.
Everyone.